Coronation Street in Emmerdale is second to Hollyoaks in the amount of cuts and axings that it faces. After a fairly rotten few years of Corrie, and a slowly uprising underdog performance by Emmerdale, we would see countless cutting measures by ITV in order to try and keep themselves on top while desperately trying to balance the books. This both resulted in a ton of long-running characters exiting, while having some fledgling talent depart a little too soon. Characters like Gail Rodwell, Eileen Grimshaw, Craig Tinker, Beth Tinker, Daisy Midgley, Max Turner, Addie Allahan, and Jenny Bradley, with some of these characters giving decades of their lives to the show, while others possibly leaving before it gets worse. This allowed the feeling of discontent to rifle through both the fans and the actors. These cuts felt hurtful and personal, as oftentimes the direction of the show feels like the problem, and not these major characters, as under Ian McLeod's reign, Coronation Street has progressively lost its identity, with multiple police detectives spearheading the show, which results in the crime being amped up to a T, and them absolutely loving to depict characters in a behavioural unit, and an insistence on having a hospital as a main set. This, coupled with the over-reliance on having cheesy over-editing and consistently trying to advocate itself to a normie audience as opposed to their key audience in soap fans. This McLeod direction has disfigured Coronation Street beyond belief, with their devout intrigue in trying to capture an audience that isn't impressed anyways. By straying beyond the core fundamentals of the soap genre, you aim to impress the casuals, but by doing this, you isolate your main audience. While acknowledging the difficulties that Coronation Street has faced, after multiple years of disappointment and a never-ending feeling of dread, which plunged Corrie down the soap rankings, ITV had enough. On the 5th of February 2025, ITV announced that from January 2026, Coronation Street and Emmerdale would move to a new schedule. They angled this as a soap power hour, where you would get Emmerdale at 8 PM and Corrie starting at 8:30. This would mean that both Corrie and Emmerdale's episodes would go to a 30-minute episode each, and an extra half an hour would be slashed from each show. They would embolden this as not a failure but a new beginning for Corrie and Emmerdale. They were not slashing an hour of TV from their flagship shows, they were simply listening to the viewing audience figures. Not only this, but they were going to transition to this new release pattern by doing a genuine first in Coronation Street and Emmerdale history. They announced CorrieDale, a groundbreaking concept where Coronation Street and Emmerdale's universes were set to blend together for the first time. This was no Children in Need special. The finest of Coronation Street are going to meet the finest of Emmerdale in 1 hour-long episode. The fans were given the opportunity to pick a scene to air between two popular characters. Take that, EastEnders. The history of soap crossovers. A crossover of soaps of this magnitude have never really been done before, and will probably never be done ever again. In the 80s, you had EastEnders characters like Nick Cotton and Arthur Fowler, who would make mentions of Coronation Street, but those were few and far between. The closest we get to a genuine crossover is when Corrie and EastEnders collided worlds for a Children in Need special. Most famously, we would see Kat Slater and Liz McDonald compare skirt lengths and tease that Liz was actually Kat's mother. So, ultimately, it was some novelty fun for a good cause. We would also see Doc Branning mention loving to watch Corrie around their 50th anniversary. One of the most underwhelming crossovers happened in 2021, where characters would be referenced from soap to soap, over them doing good causes surrounding climate change. The most interesting one was Maria Connor seeing Amelia Spencer and Liam Kavanagh dancing on a flower patch. However, in the last year or so, we will get the most groundbreaking crossover so far. Hollyoaks was celebrating its 30th anniversary by tying in its humble beginnings. They announced a huge plane crash which referred back to the famous Emmerdale plane crash, masterminded by Phil Redmond, who also created both Brookside and Hollyoaks. So, therefore, despite Brookside being cancelled in 2003, they brought it back for one episode. with exciting returns from Brookside faithfuls in Sheila and Bobby Grant returning to Brookside Close and revealing that Louis Emmerich's character Donnie Clark was actually his famous Brookside alter ego, Mick Johnson. While this was an ambitious crossover, the gap between Brookside being cancelled and this small revival felt difficult to cross. Yes, you did have exciting returns with some of Brookie's most famous faces in Sheila and Bobby Grant, but in the same way it probably should have happened sooner. Although, this blending did mean the universes were in the same world, so we would continue to see a few more Brookie faces pop up in the coming months. It's a really cool addition in theory, but you would have to find someone who was a Brookie fan at the time to get an overall perspective on it. To make the Brookside fans feel old, it was cancelled when I was 3 years old. If people don't want me to cover the Hollyoaks 30th anniversary in more detail, feel free to tell me in the comment section. What made the crossover aspect of the celebration feel worth it? Well, we would see characters from both shows interact. We also saw exciting scenes with Mick finding his daughter Gemma, while there was a real sense of danger that followed to Brookside Close. Interestingly as well, we saw Rita Simmons, who was playing Marie Fielding, settle into the Close, which made it feel bigger. It made the world feel alive and much bigger for its inclusion. We also got to see a real heartwarming scene where Sheila and Bobby admit that they'd been intimate with each other again, as a real nod to one of Brookside's most iconic pairings. Despite not having the largest cast to revive it with, the legends appeared and everyone seemed fully committed to it. This is something that CorrieDale should learn from this revival. You have the star power, now make sure that aspect of the event is covered. So, up until this point, a major crossover felt off the cards, although they hugely missed out on being the first. So, therefore, the opportunity to have some of the most iconic Cobbles characters and some of the most iconic Dales characters felt like the right approach. Perhaps the most interesting part in this is it felt like both shows' respective Christmas episodes were intentionally low-key and down-to-earth in order to play up to the great occasion, and the turning of the tides in CorrieDale and their new transmission pattern. They would spend the next 2 weeks after Christmas building up to their big moment, with their sights set on Monday the 5th of January. On the day of, they released an episode of both Corrie and Emmerdale, shot in a new style and built to the huge moment where John Sugden was driving erratically with Aaron Dingle in the car, while Becky Swain with Lisa and Betsy in tow driving dangerously down the road. And the episodes would close with the cars heading towards a huge crash. Then, to go against the norm in soap these days, CorrieDale was not released early, and you had the entire soap world desperate to wait till 8 PM Monday evening just to see how the crossover was going to take shape. What were the storylines going into it? Now, if for some reason you haven't watched CorrieDale but are still watching this video, I'll outline the key major storylines going into it from both the Coronation Street and Emmerdale perspective. Coronation Street had a major uptake on abusers heading into CorrieDale. Carl Webster, who was announced as Debbie and Kevin's brother, who spent the majority of the year destroying Kevin and Abby Webster's marriage. The underlying factor was that the audience was slowly starting to understand that Debbie is actually Carl's mum, and she was intending on telling Carl he is her son. But that didn't come out till later. Carl had been ruining everyone that hated him, as he destroyed the family, ran over Tyrone Dobbs, had an affair on Abby with James Bailey, and Debbie annoyed him by being secretive over Carl's mum Elaine, who had recently died. Kevin and Abby are expected to team up to try and unseat Carl, who is extremely drunk and running away to Germany. Theo Silverton has been abusing his partner Todd Grimshaw. They got together really quickly and it started with coercive control and accelerated towards physical abuse. Todd had recently fought back in self-defense, which put Theo in hospital, so he had been making out that he was the victim. As his treatment of Todd worsened, Todd found himself an ally in the local vicar, Billy Mayhew, his former partner. Billy discovered Theo's abuse of Todd and was desperate to get Todd away from his abuser. Billy has been a little heavy-handed over investigating how to help someone escape abuse, and Theo has found out, putting a heavy target on the vicar's back. Finally, another abuser in some form, as DS Lisa Swain, who is engaged to Carla Connor, was greatly haunted by the ghost of her past. When Lisa was introduced, she was grieving her dead wife Becky Swain, the mother of Betsy, her daughter. It would transpire that Becky was not actually dead and has been a crooked cop this whole time. Becky despises Carla and desperately tries to split the duo up, which worked, and now Becky has Carla kidnapped and we don't know where she is. Becky has been controlling and gaslighting Lisa, which Carla spotted from a mile away and was ejected out of the family. Shona and David Platt are set to have a child they didn't plan for. They are buzzing, but unfortunately for them, the baby was sick and they were going to need specialists when their baby was going to be born. The final interesting piece going into the special was that we were expecting at least one character to die in the festivities. One thing I feel is important to say here: I've never been a particularly big Emmerdale watcher. I followed EastEnders, Hollyoaks and Corrie, but have never been able to stick the landing and be there consistently. I've watched high-profile storylines over the years, but I'm not knowledgeable enough to consider myself an Emmerdale fan. Emmerdale had a slightly more low-key affair, but still had a murder on the loose in John Sugden. Intriguingly, John Sugden's actor also played Andy Carver in Corrie. John Sugden is a murderer with a hero complex. He puts people in harm's way hoping that he gets all the plaudits for saving them. He has been on the run for a few months, and at the same time his husband Aaron Dingle has been moving on with the love of his life, Robert Sugden. Therefore, John plans on kidnapping Aaron and getting his marriage back on track. Charity Dingle has gotten herself into a sticky situation where she agreed to be a surrogate for her granddaughter Sarah and Jacob. But turns out she lost their embryo and is carrying her own child, who she conceived with her ex Ross Barton. No one knows this, but Mackenzie, her partner, has a suspicion that the baby is actually his and he is desperate to find out about it. Kane and Moira will be driving Sarah and Jacob to the airport for their honeymoon. They're excited to come back to the baby's birth, not knowing it's not theirs. So a lot of people putting themselves in possible danger ahead of the big accident, and with a lot of people driving erratically at night, it sets the scene for an incredibly dangerous drive back. The episode. The episode starts with very scenic shots of everyone about to be involved in the pile-up: Lisa, Becky, Betsy, and John and Aaron. John lets the wheel go as Becky clips the car, sending the blue car on its head. Then we cut to Carl and Debbie and Kane and Moira's car, who are being flanked by Mackenzie and Charity. Continuing with the bus chauffeuring the wedding guests back home, most notably Todd, Theo, and Billy Mayhew. Carla arrives with Kit Green, who runs in the way to find Lisa and Betsy, but this causes the bus to scream to a halt too quickly as it's flipped on its side. Everyone on the bus is in agony, but they band together to escape. Carl stops paying attention to the road just as Debbie is about to tell Carl she is his mum. They crash into Lisa's beached car. Carl, for a moment, seems upset about this, but saves his own skin and pulls his mum into the driver's seat, which makes her liable for the crash. A small fire breaks out in the bottom of the bus as Mac and Charity divert away from Kane's car, which sends them crashing into a pile of hay, flooding the road with petrol. Charity and Shona, the two pregnant women involved, are alarmed over their babies and get rushed to the hospital. This wouldn't be the only surprise for Shona, as a woman tied in the back of the returning from the dead Graham Foster's van would be unveiled to be Shona's younger sister Jodie. Yes, we may have seen Graham Foster's body dead on screen, but that's not what I'm here to debate. From this moment onwards, the worlds are fully merged. John Sugden looks over passed out Carl Webster and flees into the forest. This is while the people stranded in the bus start to escape, other than Billy. The bus fire is rapidly accelerating as Todd, who comes to after being rescued by Theo, insists his partner goes into the bus to save Billy. Theo unbuckles Billy's seatbelt until he remarks, "I knew there was some good in you, Theo," and then he buckles Billy back in, leaving him trapped upside down in a death trap. The vicar accepts his fate, realizes his impending doom, and starts reciting the Lord's Prayer, while a sad piano plays in the background. The bus then detonates, with our first casualty taking shape. The only person who knows the truth about Todd's mistreatment is dead. Todd is devastated by this, leaving him once again isolated with his abusive partner. There are very fleeting moments of comedy in this gloomy and gritty episode. We see Tim Metcalfe and Chaz Dingle chatting as Tim, a cab driver who's gotten himself caught in traffic behind the massive wreck. Then, as an interesting nod to the past, Steve McDonald sees Jay Sharma, but he would know him as Vikram Desai, a man he used to be great friends with and the co-founder of Steve's business, Streetcars. It's a funny bit because of the amount of shuffling between Corrie and Emmerdale's actors over the years. They don't interact, but he sees a glimpse, which is an inspired little bit of fan service. Robert and Aaron find each other outside the wreckage. After all this upheaval, Aaron decides there is no better time to propose, once Aaron's divorce from John goes through. John's ears must be burning as he is aiming his shotgun at the duo, but he vanishes into the forest. Aaron makes Robert swear that he won't go after John, but the second Aaron is taken away by the ambulance, he breaks that vow. He first bumps into Kit in the forest and makes too much noise, which leads to Kit being whipped in the back of the head with a shotgun. Robert tells John that their father would be so disappointed with him, and when they wrestle with the gun, Kane Dingle gets shot in the stomach. Kane, being the hard man in Emmerdale, runs off with blood pouring from his wound to try and find a shooter. It takes a village and a street to band together to try and save Lisa's car from getting caught in a fire. They unite as one to push the detective's car away from the flames, as Lisa Swain avoids the fiery inferno. Becky is about to flee, but Lisa calls for a dead wife to return and say goodbye this time. Lisa catches Becky off guard and cuffs her to the ambulance with her and arrests her on the spot. We then extend to the hospital segment of CorrieDale. Mostly everyone settles back with their families and bombshells drop. Kevin knows that Carl was driving the car, not Debbie. We get the fan-voted scene between Carla and Charity, where they are both in shock. Charity flirts with Carla as they affirm their choice in their partners. Eric Pollard and Ken Barlow share the screen together. They make small talk over a vending machine and discuss their family's impact on the crash. It's a huge moment of fan service, as two of the great living legends on their respective shows meet. Shona Platt's water breaks while Charity realizes that the baby is coming. David has been running around all day, and when he is reunited with Shona, he has a seizure, which he has not had in years. Kane and Moira, touched by Jacob and Sarah's honeymoon, decide it's time to enjoy their marriage. This moment is bittersweet as the doctor diagnoses Kane with cancer. The indestructible Kane Dingle has the same illness that his late mother died to. As the episode comes to a close, we flick between the different perspectives and discoveries of the characters. Summer Spellman, Billy's daughter, breaks down learning that another one of her dads has died. Carl Webster goes into cardiac arrest. And John Sugden is found dead in the forest with his sister Victoria standing over his corpse. Vic being the one to end her brother's reign of terror. After all the carnage, the great CorrieDale ends with Chaz getting back into the car with Tim. They go back and forth talking about how close-knit their communities are. Tim mentions the famous Emmerdale plane crash and she asks him where he is from, to which he responds, "You wouldn't have heard of it." I think it was a fantastic episode which spared no expenses in delivering a chaotic night that would have ramifications through the coming months and beyond. The scope of the crash was absolutely crazy, and it created a real thrill of danger, where it felt that no one was safe. Even with the knowledge going into it that Billy Mayhew's actor Daniel Brocklebank had been axed, his death is phenomenal. It's a great exit that makes the episode feel grander while not being too deflating for the audience. I've been a notorious Billy hater over the last few years, but even I couldn't discredit his exit. It continues the story between Todd and Theo while creating an even more unstable outcome for the story. I think in the same vein it makes Billy a much greater character than he would have been before, and this complements the episode as the episode complements it. John's death as well felt necessary in order to be able to move on. It felt wonderful as well to be able to dispatch of some of the overhanging villains that were wreaking havoc on the show. Both Becky Swain and John Sugden had more than overstayed their welcome, with the return from the dead Becky being one of the most controversial choices that Corrie has made in a good long while. This continued all the storylines, us finding out who Jodie is, Debbie being Carl's mum, Theo's treatment of Todd Furthering, Shona and the baby. Then on Emmerdale, in the episode before CorrieDale, they would start to wrap up the human exploitation storyline as they would start to move beyond the villains that were holding it in stasis. People may find this a contentious point, but I find that the way it was shot and edited was really captivating. Around the time the bosses were explaining how they had to find a way to shoot it in the same style, as both Corrie and Emmerdale have a different look, so to have it be filmed on the fancier cameras and with a real change in lighting made it feel like a huge occasion and more cinematic. I don't want them to apply this approach to every single episode as it wouldn't fit in a traditional episode of either show, but for the big occasion, we'll allow it. I felt like this episode had awoken the sleeping giants of Coronation Street. Emmerdale had been on a very courageous rise, with it being one of the more consistently good soaps over the last few years. But for me, Corrie had become the show with fleeting great moments but never anything consistent. I remarked earlier that I felt that the respective Christmas episodes were intentionally down to earth, but it didn't help the slightly disgruntled Corrie fan in me wondering what was going to make me care again. CorrieDale made me care again, and the change in its release pattern meant that Corrie went from 3 hour-long episodes I struggled to get through to a more-ish 30-minute episode which I've never fallen behind on since the change. As someone who wasn't a traditional Emmerdale watcher, the build-up to the episode released was watertight, and explained the necessary context while setting up the episode so well, and the same extended to the Corrie episode they released. To swap to the negatives, I hope that CorrieDale isn't a poisoned chalice where it was an exceptional promotional tool for its new streaming pattern. But in a way it could have been too successful for Coronation Street to ignore. Since these episodes we've been dealing with the aftermath of this, and Corrie had quickly announced the next big event. The next one taking place in February was a flash forward, with there being more format-breaking episodes. Whether it's a fantastic episode or not, the success of CorrieDale could make Coronation Street's eye wander, where they keep trying to reach the same highs as before. Will they stray even further than they currently do to reach this level? I'm not sure I currently trust the Corrie bosses to not strive for these rating highs, but without doing their due diligence and building it up as well as they did CorrieDale. Continuing my gripes further, I have to maintain that as much as it was successful about rekindling my love for Corrie, I was unsuccessful in my attempts to finally get back into Emmerdale. It unfortunately felt like we were in a hangover period where you could just not escape CorrieDale, but there was just an overall funk, where I felt like there was just so much trauma to process that there was not much comedy or light in general. Likewise, it didn't necessarily solve Coronation Street's villain problem, with them just ramping up towards their fancy new flash-forward storyline. Whether that is successful or not is beyond the point, but it has definitely been hard to maintain the momentum beyond CorrieDale. The crossover. The tantalising prospect of this episode is of course the crossover, so how did the crossover aspect of this episode hold up? We would intermittently see the police officers, doctors and paramedics intertwine their stories, with them helping the residents of the crash. This didn't really lend to many interesting interactions between the characters. They majorly kept to themselves. The scenes with Charity and Carla were engaging, the Ken and Pollard scene was quite unstated but valuable. The actual crossover aspect is probably one of the weaker aspects of the show. In the build-up it felt pretty difficult to be able to pose characters you would want to see interact, but a lot of the drama was self-contained and you can understand why, but it almost works to its detriment. Most of the interactions are just fan-servicey and surface level, which makes sense because of the circumstances, but it is possibly the most fragile part of this crossover. You could strip out the Corrie characters and it would work as an Emmerdale episode, and you could strip out the Emmerdale pieces and it would feel like Coronation Street. At the time, I made several videos on the channel explaining how I thought it was a masterpiece and was the perfect storm. Did it hold up? I think it does. Even removed from all of the promotional material and hype, the episode is pretty succinct and is infinitely replayable. To its credit, it feels exceptionally easy to explain, and even if you don't know that much about Corrie or Emmerdale, it feels like a non-viewer could follow along without too many questions. That is a credit to itself, and the job well done that does complement what in my opinion is one of the most monumental episodes of Coronation Street and Emmerdale I have ever seen. With that in mind though, I will assert that this is hardly replicable. So, after all that, was CorrieDale worth it? To no one's surprise, I would have to say yes. There were very little pitfalls in the episode in my opinion, and it extended to a really magnificent episode, and lends itself to the brand new Soap Power Hour, which for me has made them exceptionally more agreeable than it has been prior, and reminded me what Corrie is capable of. Then, even more so, it allowed me to have an admittedly lesser period of consistently watching Emmerdale. I think it was the best of what these current respective teams could do, and will stand the test of time with the episode standing out as legendary. I would definitely not want a CorrieDale crossover more frequently, though it was a nice treat. Ironically, the crossover aspect of it is debatably the weakest, but I would find it really hard to find a scenario how they could do it better. The pairing of these great soap icons never really manifested. I recognise that we did have Pollard and Ken and Charity and Carla scenes that were great, but somehow the deleted scene between Sam Dingle and Kirk Sutherland were the best aspects of the characters intertwining. But equally, some of the great characters of old are not around anymore. To that effect, it felt like they cut corners with some of the cast they allowed on shoot. Instead of a lot of these characters being bona fide legends, we had to make space for the detectives, the paramedics, the doctors. In the same, it felt like a massive missed opportunity to not see the locations interact either. The Cobbles and Emmerdale farm are characters in themselves. How would the Rovers respond to the Woolpack? Could certain characters strike up a fleeting friendship, or even have characters have a little fling? I recognise that the framing and the structure is what makes this episode feel so grand, but it is lacking that distinct soap charm. Yes, Corrie and Emmerdale characters have reacted to each other, but the drama is in the crash, not in the characters. It's almost as if they didn't trust in the quality of the scripts, so had to deliver in a big stunt, which to its credit is absolutely huge and the overarching message that is left with the audience. It's just that the key marketing of this episode is the crossover, and it's overshadowed by the stunt. This episode had generally mind-blowing moments on both sides of the coin. Billy's death becomes one of legend due to it taking place within this episode. It's a beautiful ending to the character, even in death he was seeing the good in people. My only gripe with it, I think it could have done with a little bit more time, and they should have licensed an actual song which I think would have sent it over the edge. The Graham Foster return was a shock for more reasons than one, but mostly because we saw his dead body on screen. I think diagnosing Kane with cancer is a really enthralling twist, and we aren't even that far removed from seeing Faith, his mum's death. Never mind, just checked it, it's nearly been 4 years. The car pileup was sensational, and its scope kept widening as the cars kept stacking. It is chock full of so many moments that I feel a ton of the audience would have different scenes that resonated with them. John Sugden's death was a lasting surprise, but the right time for it, and it would create a huge shockwave that would be felt beyond. To assess if it was successful at changing the soap release schedule and emboldening this new Soap Power Hour, I would have to agree. It has made Corrie for me exceedingly moreish, and it's often the first thing I watch when I wake up. It hadn't solved all their issues though, with them hurtling straight to the next storyline in the flash forward. This, instead of allowing the audience a breather after this big event, has sent the audience hurling towards the next viewership high. As I maintained from earlier, I'm desperate to observe that Corrie and Emmerdale don't forget the fundamentals. Yes, the episode was monumental, but I wouldn't want this success to depict their next decisions. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event that works because of so much history outside of each other's orbit. In that regard, it would be preposterous of them to keep trying to reach this high. You cannot manufacture this level of hype, and to do so, it once again feels like you would be isolating your core audience. To continue that thought, I struggled to keep watching Emmerdale and tapped out after a month of keeping up with it. If that's coming from me, someone who has spent the last several years covering the soaps, what's to tell how many of your audience have followed suit? This grand occasion was intended to draw tons of eyes, and the whole soap world was watching. But are they still watching now? The jury is still out on that one. If there is one lasting impression in my mind, I sincerely hope the ITV bosses don't keep trying to replicate this success. We have to believe they won't keep striving for these gimmicks to maintain the audience, because if they aren't able to stay beyond these big episodes, they aren't your core audience. I still believe that soaps can be huge, even without the pomp and circumstances. Now, have a drink if you heard this before, but EastEnders had something of a golden era in the build-up to the 40th anniversary, but even still that is not maintained beyond Chris Clenshaw leaving the show. What brought them up to that level, first relying back on its humble beginnings in leaning on family-based drama, not gimmicks or over-editing like Coronation Street has been guilty of implementing these last few years. They made a few calculated gambles, like the flash forward that Corrie is doing now. I think the CorrieDale wager has given Corrie and Emmerdale the best opportunity of reaching one of the largest audiences they've had in years. It's simply up to ITV now not to fumble the bag. I think it's going to be novel to see what happens next for both shows. What is their next big storyline after the flash forward, and if it's a never seen before again, I think a lot of us will start to get a little bit worried. So yes, I think the CorrieDale experiment was a massive success. It drew tons of disgruntled eyes back to the soaps and gave people something to believe in again. Now the ball is in Coronation Street and Emmerdale's court. I for one have been quite satisfied with the direction since, but in my eyes it only takes a few bad weeks or months for the hype and anticipation to derail. What did you think of CorrieDale, and in your eyes, was it worth it?